Okay. Welcome members to the 60th meeting of the Committee for Finance. Are we here live?
Yeah, we're still spinning.
Spinning.
There we go.
Okay, welcome members to the 60th meeting of the Committee for Finance in the 22 to 27 mandate. As always, this will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. If you want to use a phone, make sure it's silent or on airplane mode. And that goes for those in the public gallery too. Not permitted to take photographs or record the meeting. Agenda item 1 is apologies. We have 2 apologies, one from Steve Aiken and the other from Harry Harvey, with a couple of members joining us remotely. Agenda item 2 is declaration of interests. Members, you are declared to oblige any relevant financial or other interests at each committee meeting as applicable. Is anybody interested there? No, obviously you can do so as we go as well. Chairperson's business. So members, 3.1 is the written statement which we got last Friday, which is in relation to Treasury funding for 26-29, from financial year 26 through to 29-30. The Finance Minister is obliged to lay this document at least 14 days before laying a draft budget for the financial year. A copy was also emailed to members once it was received. Does anybody wish to make any comment about that? No, I think it largely, unless anybody wants to correct me, largely reflects what was in this CSR, the spending review, in June. Okay, members, 3.2 is a baby loss awareness event. Members, Gemma Dolan is hosting a SANS ribbon display ceremony. Our colleague Gemma is. She's hosting that tomorrow morning at 10:30 on the steps of Parliament Building. So obviously members are if anyone can attend that would be welcome, and thanks to Gemma for organising that. We are also organising a committee event for Tuesday the 14th of October at 2:30 p.m. here in Parliament Buildings, and a draft press release has been prepared, which is in front of you in hard copy, and I think it can be emailed to members. It's going to be emailed now to members who are remote.
Sure, it's largely based on information that the stakeholders wanted to bring forward, and then there's a few quotes from yourself and the Deputy Chair.
Great. So I'm content with that, members, unless if anybody has any particular comments, either raise them now or I'm sure we can deal with them afterwards. It doesn't have to be decided now. Go ahead, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much for putting this together. I think it's really, really important that we do, Margaret, especially whenever we're seeing positive progression for it. And I'll, all being well, be at Gemma's event in the morning. I think it's great to see her doing that as well, and encourage others if they can go to it. Just wanted to know what the event was, and will everybody be able to be at that? Do you know, is everybody about next Tuesday? It would be great to see everybody.
Yeah, we're really hoping we can get a good turnout from committee. It's during questions, but it's not finance questions, so that's probably our trickiest bit. I think I want to say it's communities. Is it communities? Yeah, communities. So we're hoping that doesn't necessarily impact on anyone. So we went for 2:30 because that's really when Kelly was able to come up. So it's going to be about forget-me-nots, who members will recall gave evidence to the committee during the death, stillbirth and baby loss certificates spill. So we're basically going to look to do a bit of media with Kelly, photographs, bit to video if we can as well. We should have our videographers, and really just talking about where the committee has got to now in terms of committee stage of the bill is finished. We're now looking forward to the baby loss certificates coming in the months ahead. The consideration stage, further consideration stage and final stage of the bill have now been scheduled. So we are in that home straight, and it's really just a case of being able to push that out so people are aware of it, and Forget-Me-Not and obviously SANS as well are really keen to get that information out there that the baby loss certificates are coming. We've got to that point that the bill is progressing now, and they'll be able to do that within the next number of months.
Great. Okay, that would be thank you, team, for helping to facilitate that. And I think it's really worthwhile. It's a really important bit of work that we've done. So, members, please do make an effort to attend if you're able. Okay. So,
members, in terms of where, Chair, we always prefer to do these things outside if we can. if we don't have the weather, our first protocol is probably Great Hall, depending on what that's like. If not, we maybe take things upstairs, and we find suitable space there. We have something in mind, but ideally we want to be outside at the front of the building. That's our preference. So if anyone can organise no rain for that day, it'd be great.
Do our best.
Okay, so members, agenda item 4 is relates to a
3.3.
3.3. Apologies. 3.3 is an answer to assembly written question submitted by me on Casement Park. It confirms that the Communities Minister and the Finance Minister had a meeting on the 29th of September in which they discussed Casement Park. I suppose we're saying that is a good thing. My perspective is that they had a meeting eventually. It's also worth saying that we're going to come to this under matters arising, because I'll just cover that now while we're here for members' awareness, so that we can get through that. So we'll go back to, so if you look at 5.7, which is page 71 of the main meeting pack, is a written answer from Lord Livermore, who's the Lord's Treasury Minister, to Lord Weir, and that question confirmed that confirms the terms of the £50 million financial transactions capital. We had a little bit of discussion about what net basis means. The answer says that it is for the NI executive to take decisions on the design and implementation of the financial transaction, including whether to take long-term equity in the project. Now, that's why that slightly concerns me. It doesn't concern me in principle, but there does appear to be a slight variance between what the UK government is saying and what the executive is saying on financial transactions capital and how it will be used, in the sense that I think I'm right in saying, but I'm happy to be corrected, that when the finance minister was asked the other day, he said it was for the UK government to detail or specify how this would be accounted for, or words to that effect. The UK government is effectively saying not quite the opposite, but close to the opposite of that. So I think this reinforces a couple of things. It's also important to say that it does, the answer to Lord Weir is helpful in the sense that it clarifies that the financial transaction, the meaning of net basis, or one of the meanings of net basis, is that it does not need to be repaid to the executive, and the executive can recycle any repayments indefinitely. So that's good to know. But I think there are, I have personally, have two concerns. One is, the slight variance in terms of precisely the understanding of what is understood by how this financial transactions capital is going to be accounted for. But in general, I think it's a good thing that it's been provided. The bigger issue, I think, is, from my perspective, this, in both regards, appears to be a bit of a limbo here around this funding and around this project. And I think, notwithstanding some of the difference of opinion or difference of emphasis on this, it is an executive project and there's no clarity on how it's being delivered. I would hope that it's going to be in the multi-year budget, but we don't know. So my suggestion to the committee is that we go back and ask for a readout of the meeting on the 29th of September and what the next step is on this project. Are members agreed, content with that? Mm-hmm. Are you content? And then would you wish to come in? You absolutely, Brian Kingston.
It's just to understand what is meant by equity in this case. Does that mean the executive owns a stake of the stadium, or does it mean,
yes,
as profits are made, that money will be repaid to the executive? Because it talks there about the executive can recycle any repayments indefinitely. So I'm not sure what that means.
So in a financial transaction, under financial transactions capital, the money has to be repaid. Basically, because it's not grant aid. It's not just like grant aid that's gone. So the money has to be repaid in some form.
To UK government, but to the.
But it says the payments are just going to be recycled. In terms of how the equity works, I think this is one of the outstanding questions. And the simple understanding is that either the executive or the UK government, I think this is where we'll own a portion, or there will be a company or some kind of entity that owns. That's my assumption. That would be the obvious meaning of equity in terms of what that means thereafter. I don't know, and that's what I think we need to understand. And I think the fact that there's no clarity on that is why we need to ask if members are content that we get clarity on those things urgently and ideally for next week's meeting, because I'm slightly worried that we don't as yet have clarity in any of those things. Are members content that we ask those questions? Okay, grand. I think it's really important that we get answers to that ASAP. Thank you. Okay, now we'll move on to agenda item 4, which are draft minutes of the meeting, the first meeting we held last week, the 1st of October. They're page 12 of the meeting pack. If members are content that the minutes in page 12 are a true reflection of the meeting, I will sign them. Content? Great, okay. 5 matters arising. 5.1 is from the Department of Finance. It's the response to the death, stillbirths and baby loss bill, and 5.2 is death, stillbirths and baby loss bill notification of amendments. So members at page 24 of the meeting pack, there is correspondence from the DALO in relation to the committee's report on the deaths, stillbirths and baby loss bill. And at page 25 of the meeting pack, there's a notice of amendments tabled on the 1st of October for consideration stage of the deaths, stillbirths and baby loss bill. Members, the DALO has now confirmed dates for the next legislative stage of the bill. They are consideration stage, Tuesday the 21st of October, further consideration stage, Tuesday the 11th of November, and final stage, Monday the 24th of November. Those are to note. I'm sure there will be discussion on those amendments. Yes, Diane Forsyth, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I just want to say it's good to see those dates coming through. And I know the Minister had indicated that he hoped this would be through this calendar year, and we felt it would be tight. So just wanted to say thanks very much to the clerk and wider team for pulling that report together so quickly, because I think we got through quite a lot, got a lot of evidence, and we certainly, in terms of the committee, have helped to move this forward at pace, because I know we were all quite concerned about that. So I think that it's coming together well. Thank you.
Indeed. Okay. 5.3 is from the Department of Finance, and that relates to the aligning budget to the programme for government document, which was published last week, I believe. It is at page 26 of the meeting pack. As part of the Executive's Budget Sustainability Plan and the associated Budget Improvement Plan roadmap, the Executive made a commitment to publish a document reflecting on the alignment between the PFG and the budget. So that is what was published last week. The Department highlights that the report shows that 42% of the resource budget and 78% of the capital budget are aligned with the 9 PFG priorities. I would say, and bringing others for commentary, I think, first of all, I think the publication of this document is in some ways is progress. I remain to be convinced that this document is a convincing account of how money is being clearly directed towards specific outcomes rather than very broadly designed aspirational statements, which are not, as it were, priorities, let alone targets. So I would still be deeply sceptical that these are that this document is as useful as it should be. Nevertheless, it has some use from my perspective, and I'm obviously speaking in a personal capacity. But so, for example, I think Chart 8 indicates that we spend a very small percentage of our budget on the planet, and I think that is unsurprising given I'm speaking obviously in a personal party capacity. But does anybody else wish to come in or comment on that? Go ahead, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And yes, whilst obviously we always hope to see better. I think that the document and the exercise itself is very useful, and it's good to see it as part of the, the budget sustainability process going forward. This is new, working towards multi-year budgets. It's challenging for departments, and to be able to put this document together, I think it's really, really good to point and highlight what those objectives are. And just wanted to check, I'm presuming this is live and there will be updates on this. So obviously this is coming forward now, and this is where they're looking at the budget. But as we go through the year, things will be moved around and spent a different way. I think it would be really, really useful just to see that coming through in terms of that management reporting. And I think it is a really good step in the right direction, and it does show the pressures that where you have spending priorities, yet you still have departments to run, it's difficult to align to those, and where people criticise that people aren't delivering on things like,
Is that there?
like things like housing, we hear often from the opposition, but there's only so much you can do whenever the budget pressures are there. But I just wanted to say, I think that this document is a really good progress document as part of budget sustainability, and I think that it'll be a good tool for us going forward in terms of our scrutiny here.
I would want to be clear, so I would certainly acknowledge that it is a step in the right direction. I might say it's not a big enough step, but it is a step in the right direction. One, I think, thing we might want to reflect on is whether this document might be either better produced by or interrogated by the Fiscal Council as part of our interrogation of that bill. But I'm not going to be totally churlish and say that it's without value, because I think there clearly is. It's a step in the right direction, something to be built upon, even if I've some criticisms of it. But does anyone else wish to comment on it? No. Okay. We'll move on. 5.4 is the Department of Finance. Sorry, yes. If members are content, we will circulate that report to other statutory committees and to the Audit Committee for their information. I think. Sorry.
It might also be worth. It occurs to me making sure the Fiscal Council has it. If members are content, we can add them to that list.
Can I suggest we ask them for their view on it? And I think that would be a useful thing for us to do. Okay. 5.4 is from the department, and it is the India Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. At page 68 of the meeting pack, the department has updated the committee in relation to, the CETA with India, the Economic and Trade Agreement, and its progress towards ratification. When this is completed, the Cabinet Office intends to lay statutory instrument to add the agreement to Schedule 9 of the Procurement Act. This schedule details the international agreements that the UK is party to since it left the EU. Essentially, this means a contracting authority may not, in carrying out a procurement, discriminate against a treaty state supplier. The Procurement Act defines this as treating the supplier less favourably than it treats or would treat a domestic supplier. So this is to note this.
I wonder, could we ask for some clarity around this in terms of whether there is any differentiation between GB and NI on this in terms of the anti-discrimination and procurement, just given the protocol and Windsor framework?
Sure. I think, did we, has that question been asked already, in some form?
We talked
about it, but we haven't, okay. But we'll get an answer on the record, I think that's fine, yeah. Okay, now we're going to go on to, so 5.5 are some DALO readout responses. The first is at 5.6, which is secondary legislation schedule from the department. That's at page 70 of the meeting pack. The department has provided an indicative schedule of secondary legislation items. These will be added to the committee's forward work programme. 5.7 is House of Lords answer on Casement Park funding. We already have, we've already discussed that. So we'll move on to 5.8, excuse me, which is correspondence which we've been copied into for unprotected mothers. NI regarding safeguarding issues. We've had similar correspondence. It's not linked to our strategic priorities, so we will let other committees handle that. 5.9 is the 46th report of the Examiner of Statutory Rules. The Examiner of Statutory Rules has now formally reported on SR 2025-150, the Coronavirus Act 2020, registration of deaths and stillbirths extension order in Northern Ireland 2025. That's what we debated yesterday in the Chamber and formally extended. The Examiner had confirmed that no that the rule does not require being drawn to the special attention of the Assembly. So that's to note. 5.10 relates to, so if you move to the tabled pack, this is at page 7 of the tabled pack. And this is correspondence that we have back from the Finance Minister. Helpfully enough, the Finance Minister has given us a pretty useful response, even if it doesn't answer everything we want. It's we wrote to the Minister, as well as writing to the Executive Office, to seek clarification over the appraisal process for the role of the head of the civil service. Now, there's some reporting about this. The Minister indicates that the next performance management, there was previously some reporting on this. The letter basically indicates that the performance management policy, which applies to all civil servants, doesn't apply to the head of the civil service. The Minister points out that the head of the civil service role is unique in that it is no line management structure or reporting officer or countersigning officer to undertake the normal appraisal process as provided for under performance management policy. Therefore, the performance process applied to other SCS roles has historically not been applied to the head of the civil service role, i.e. current or previous office holders, but I want to come back to that. The head of the civil service role is not subject to any performance-related bonuses, but rather it receives incremental rises as other civil servants do, in conjunction with pay awards. It gets progression, and basically the same increases that other civil servants receive. Finally, it is highlighted that the next performance management policy is currently being reviewed and will include consideration of head of civil service performance management arrangements and how this could be appropriately managed without undermining the political impartiality of the civil service. Now, I think it's helpful that we've got this response, members, first of all, and thanks to the Finance Department for actually giving us a response. We haven't got one yet from the Executive Office, and I'm not sure we will. I think there's been some reporting on this. I think this is something we're going to have to pay close attention to when we begin our work on civil service reform, because in a kind of, this isn't a personal thing, this is about the role of the head of the civil service and understanding how it is governed. I think it's true to say it appears that for example, the Cabinet Secretary, the UK Cabinet Secretary, there is some form of appraisal process with the lead non-executive director in the UK government. Now, to what extent that is a full-blown appraisal, I'm sure is debatable, but there is some performance management structure. The fact there isn't one at all for the head of the civil service here, I think, is something that we need to pay close attention to, in particular because in that letter it indicates that they're looking at it, that they're reviewing it. So I think we need to ask, are they reviewing it with a particular endpoint in mind? Do they anticipate changing how it's going to work? Do they anticipate creating new reporting structures or revising it? Because at the minute it kind of appears to be just there. I do want to just interrogate slightly the assertion that was made about that effectively no head of the civil service has ever had any performance management. I think that's worth just getting to the bottom of that if we can, and just asking if they're sure about that there was no process in the past.
I suppose, Chair, the difference in the past was Hawkes was by default the permanent secretary in the executive officer, what was OFM, DFM before that. And it might be worth clarifying what their role was in relation to other permanent secretaries. I can't be accurate on this necessarily, but I seem to recall they had a role in the appraisal of other permanent secretaries, but as this suggests, there was no particular appraisal of them. But it'd be worth checking out just exactly what their role was and how it has differed. So if members are going to, we can seek clarity on all of those points.
Yes, and if there's any, so for example, I don't know what happens in Dublin or Edinburgh for that matter. I do know, and obviously it would be different now because the permanent secretary of the Scottish Government is a UK civil servant. The head of the Civil Service in Northern Ireland is not. They're in the NI Civil Service. But for example, I know the Cabinet Secretary has a feedback process involving, I think, other permanent secretaries, and we don't seem to have any of that. And I think we need to establish why, and if they are content that if there's a specific reason that this one civil servant has no appraisal process whatsoever. I think it's reasonable for us to ask that. Go ahead, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think that, just because something has always happened a particular way shouldn't be the reason
Indeed.
that it continues as is. And I note that, reference is made to the fact that there's no performance-related bonus here, but it's my understanding that across the civil service, to get your pay award, you should at least be measured and marked as satisfactory or effective. So the tone from the top of the organisation, should echo that down throughout, in my opinion. So
I presume the implication here is that there is no means to do box marking
yeah,
at all for the head of the civil service.
that's what I'm
So
saying.
they're
Chair,
the
just
only people who automatically get a pay rise, because every other civil servant has to be satisfactory. I think we should clarify that with the Minister, because if the other 20,000 can only get a pay rise if they meet some basic level of performance. And there's obviously a question about how many boxes there are under the civil service, and should it be more, and should it be incentivised a bit more. That's a separate question. But in order to to progress, every other civil servant has to, and this one civil servant doesn't, and that's just not a reflection of the individual. It's just a question of the way that rule is structured and whether that is the right way. So it'd be helpful to have a view from the department as to whether they think, if the review they're carrying out, is it a review or is it being reviewed? They're not necessarily the same thing. Things can be kept under a constant review, but that doesn't mean it's a specific review with a specific endpoint in mind. So I think we need to know which of those it is. And obviously we'll be asking more about these questions in our civil service reform, HR inquiry in the next couple of months. And I also think the historic point to absolutely copper bottom, whether they are sure that no previous head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service had any performance management or even feedback structure, because some of these things aren't simply about whether you get a pay rise or not, or whether you go up the scale. It's about, are you even getting, is there a structured form of feedback, which I think everybody in their job should, if we're in politicians, we're very strange jobs, but we get the ultimate form of feedback, which is standing for election. But everyone should have the right to have a management structure where a manager and their counterparts give them some feedback on their performance, good or bad or indifferent. Okay, I think we should ask those questions. Thank you, members. Who's happy enough for that? Grand. Okay, next is 5.11, and that's an update on the Whitehall Local Growth Fund. That's at page 10 of the table pack. The Minister has provided an update on the Local Growth Fund. The Minister indicates that the Shared Prosperity Fund will end without a successor, and the new Local Growth Fund will skew heavily towards capital. It'll be 2/3, 66%. The Minister states that this will result in a significant reduction in resource, as the SPF in comparison was predominantly resource-based. The Minister met with the VCS representatives and heard how the reduction, sorry, when I say VCS I mean voluntary community sector, and he heard from them how reduction in resource funding will have a detrimental impact on the sector. Obviously, and this is, I guess, me adding my views, that's obviously particularly after European resource funding was lost to them too. I presume it will compound that. The Minister raised his concerns directly with the Secretary of State, Hilary Benn, who is committed to arranging a trilateral meeting involving the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to explore any potential flexibility on the funding split. Members, I think we should try and seek at some point, subject to our very busy forward work programme, an oral briefing on this. Go ahead, Deputy Chair, and then Brian.
Yeah, thank you. Just on that final paragraph, I welcome that the Ministers took these steps, but he says that the Secretary of State has committed to arranging a trilateral meeting. I wonder, should the committee write in support of the Minister's position to the Secretary of State to say, when is this meeting?
Yeah, I think it's
because
that's fair enough, yeah.
Committed to arranging, like we're reaching the end of the year here. It is getting incredibly pressing.
Yeah, I think that's a fair enough thing, yeah, to do. If members are content with that, we can note that. Go ahead, Brian.
Yep. In terms of the briefing request, if there is funding for employability, community-based employability support projects, that's referenced in the NICFA briefing there, 6,636 people supported into employment. So perhaps we could also ask from the Minister, from the Department, about the Pathways to Work funding in the Green Paper that was launched, and then whether it was subsequently changed, but there was, I think, £1 billion, across the UK intending to be provided for employability support projects. So I think that would be relevant, because that's one of the sectors which many of those groups providing that employability support at community level who have no certainty about future funding.
Yeah, I think that's really reasonable. So we'll ask those additional questions. Is everyone else content? Anyone else want to come in on this point? No? Okay. Stuart Clark, yeah.
Chair, we're going to go into a closed
Yeah.
session now, but we know we have the Scottish Fiscal Commissioner here. He's ready to go.
Okay. So we
Now,
don't want
we
to do
haven't got Hansard.
We could do that.
we
We can
also
go
needed.
in. I'm sure they won't mind waiting for just to try and get this.
If we're going to, do you want to go ahead?
Should we just do that? Let's do this. So we get because
Okay.
we're going to go into closed session. I think we were due to have it 15 minutes, so we'll try and get it done relatively pronto. Thank you, Heather. We're going to
Members
close
are
session.
agreed then?
Everyone's watching.
Thank you.
We're agreed. Yeah, we're going to close session.
Senate Chamber. Sound. 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 Senate Chamber. Sound.
Waiting outside.
So,
Oh yeah, and Chair, we also, if members are content, I'll summarise what we've agreed to do in that session.
once we're in open session, yeah.
Once we get an open
Yeah.
session, we're just waiting for the spinning. that's us in open session again now. So, Chair, if members are content, I'll summarise what was agreed in closed session, and that was that members sent to the department the issues raised by the Office of the Examiner of Statutory Rules around Schedule 1, Para 5.3, and anything else that's been raised in the advice. We get a response from the department, and then on that, receipt of that, we send that on to the Office of the Examiner of Statutory Rules, seek their view, and then based on their view, we arrange to have them come and give an oral briefing, if members are content, Chair.
Yes.
Content, thank
Dealt
you.
with all that, members are content? Yep, okay. So now, members, we are going to, we're going to have move to our briefing with the Scottish Fiscal Commission, I should say. Members, at the table pack, page 20 of your tabled pack, there is a briefing note on the Scottish Fiscal Commission evidence session. This is a third in our series of focus sessions to establish a thorough evidence base for us on the Fiscal Council bill. There's a clerk's memo at page 20, a raised paper on the rules and remits of independent fiscal institutions, specifically in the UK and Ireland. That's at page 24. Framework document between the Fiscal Commission and Scottish Government is page 49. Page 78 of the table pack is a series of MOUs between Scottish Fiscal Commission and relevant bodies, including Audit Scotland, DWP, HM Treasury, HMRC, OBR, Revenue Scotland, and with the Scottish Government re the provision of internal audit services. And you will note the fact that there is a mix of devolved and UK departments that they have specific MOUs with, and that's a question I'm sure that we'll want to understand.
Popping them up on the screen now. There we go, Chair.
Coming up. There we are. Hello. We have the confusingly but happily named John Ireland joining us from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Hi, John. But also Professor Graham Roy. So we've got John Ireland, who is Chief Executive of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and Professor Graham Roy, who is Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Hello, Professor Roy, and hello, John. We're really grateful for you both making the time to join us today. It's really helpful in terms of our deliberations on our own statute here. So it would be really helpful if one or both of you, I think Professor Roy has agreed to do an opening statement, but any opening remarks are welcome. Thank you, and thank you both very much.
Great, excellent. Can you hear us okay, Convener?
We can hear you, and I think all our members can. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and yeah, it's a real privilege to come along and give evidence to you today. So what I'll do is I'll say a bit about who we are and some of the lessons or some of the reflections we've got about our independence and how we're set up that could be useful for the committee's work. We've actually followed the work of the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council quite closely since it was established in 2021. Indeed, actually, the teams have worked quite closely with council staff in developing some of our work on longer-term fiscal sustainability. A bit about our own legislation. So our own legislation was passed through the Scottish Parliament in 2016, and we became a statutory body the following year. Since then, the OECD have reviewed us twice, building upon their own principles that they recommend fiscal councils follow, and these principles are well worth considering. Indeed, in the very first review of the SFC, the OECD explicitly looked at how our Act supported our work. As I said, I've approached this session by thinking about if there's any insights from our legislation and wider experience which may be helpful in your scrutiny of your own bill. And what I want to do is focus on three issues: independence, remit, and external review. The first of these, independence, I argue, is the most important for any fiscal institution to carry out its work without political interference or pressure from either devolved government or national government. And this is, for me, the essential prerequisite for any independent fiscal institution. Independence covers a number of different dimensions. It's not just the independence of the institution, but the independence of its members, including how they are selected, clarification about disqualification to be appointed, and the term length. One difference I did note with our own legislation on council members is the involvement of the Scottish Parliament in our appointment process and in dismissals. So our commissioners are appointed by Scottish ministers following approval by a vote in the Scottish Parliament. Similarly, commissioners can only be dismissed by ministers following a vote of the Parliament. The involvement of Parliament adds another check to the government's role, and my observation too is that it also helps foster ownership of our activities, not just within government, but also by Parliament and its Finance Committee.
Just on that. Okay, go ahead, John.
Yep.
I'll ask that at the end. Go ahead.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, another element of our independence concerns the resourcing of the council. It's not mentioned in our own legislation, but our first framework agreement with the Scottish Government, including an element of multi-year funding with a clear settlement for the year ahead and indicative settlements for the following 2 years. You'll be aware that the UK Treasury now gives the OBR a rolling 3-year settlement, and our last external review suggested we consider a similar approach. A further element of independence concerns information. Having access to the information required to do the job you want any fiscal institution to do is essential. It's helpful to include a statutory right of access, as you do in your bill from time to time. It's helpful to remind people of this provision. Finally, I note the explicit statement in the bill that the Council is not subject to the direction or control of ministers, departments, the Assembly or the UK Government. This matches a similar statement in our own legislation and one that is reflected in our 2 operational agreements with government. The second theme beyond independence I've mentioned is remit. I'm not going to say too much about the proposed function of the Council, although I'm very happy to discuss these in questions and talk about our forecasting functions if helpful. One thing I would say is that the inclusion of a general power to publish reports on public finances in Scotland has been very helpful to us over the years as we developed our work. I see that you've included a similar function in your bill, and we make use of that power here to publish our fiscal sustainability reports, and also to have flexibility to expand our commentary on any fiscal issues beyond the set-piece fiscal events. And finally, the third issue of external evaluation. We've now gone through 2 such evaluations. I found them both to be really valuable exercises. Our first review was after 2 years as a statutory body. We thought that might be too early at the time, but actually it wasn't. 2 years allowed us to make a start without everything being set in stone. And I see that you're proposing the first review within the first year as a statutory body. This could make sense. Our role changed when our Act was passed in 2016 from approving the Scottish Government forecast to doing these ourselves, and it took us time to establish these new responsibilities. That's a more substantive change in function than you're envisaging with your council. I hope these remarks are helpful, and I'm more than happy to take any questions, and either John or I will do our best to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really helpful. As always, members, please indicate should you wish to ask a question, and there are I have lots of questions, I suppose. First of all, is it right to say that the Scottish Fiscal Commission was born out of discussions around the Smith Commission?
Yeah, so the Fiscal Commission, the original debates around the Fiscal Commission were part of a broader debate within the Parliament more generally around that if Scotland was going to get greater fiscal powers under a revised constitutional settlement, then having an independent fiscal institution as part of that was a key pillar within the institutional and the governance makeup that was needed. So essentially the Smith Commission and then the fiscal framework that then underpinned the fiscal elements of the Smith Commission was essentially the core driving of the creation of the Scottish Fiscal Commission.
I suppose unlike us, where the part of the stimulant or catalyst for creating the Fiscal Commission was an agreement or a determination, which then was ultimately agreed by the UK Government and the Scottish Government, to devolve more fiscal powers to the Scottish Government and Parliament. Just an observation, because we haven't agreed. That's not a consensus here yet by any means. It's not even a clear policy intent. But so we're setting our fiscal council up, as it were, before that happens, or without that happening. In terms of the relationship between the Parliament, you've obviously, and this is really helpful, so thank you for a busy schedule going away and having a look at our legislation so that you're able to give us a comparative view on your own legislation or your statutory underpinning. Your relationship with the Scottish Parliament is more, you have more of a direct legislative relationship with the Scottish Parliament than is proposed in the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council Bill. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And a couple of just quick comments on that.
Yeah.
So on your point about the transfer of fiscal powers, and that's been a motivation, and that's clearly been something which has been significant to us in the Fiscal Commission, given the important role that we have around forecasting devolved taxes, income tax and social security.
Yeah.
But actually, if you look at a lot of our work more recently, a lot of our work is looking at long-term fiscal sustainability questions and questions around public spending, and a lot of those powers were already in place within the Parliament. So actually having an independent fiscal institution to do that sort of analysis in a way which is impartial, that's got the right of access to government data, that can then engage with the Parliament, actually has been something which I think has been quite beneficial. On the point about the relationship with the Parliament, John might want to say a bit more in that. But yeah, we have a very close and engaged relationship with the Parliament. I mentioned the additional roles that they have around appointments, and that's a significant role that they have about us. But we also give evidence on a very regular basis to them, to the Finance Committee in particular, around things like our data needs, our evaluation of our forecasts, around the what we do around the budget. So we have a very close relationship with the Parliament, because we see our role not just from the statutory responsibilities we have, but the actual day-to-day activities we do informs the work of the Parliament.
Right.
John, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think our relationship with the Parliament sort of comes from a number of places. In part, it comes from our Act, which, as Graham says, has these provisions about appointments, which have that sort of double element of both parliamentary and also our government. But also, at the same time as following the report of the Smith Commission and our establishment, the Scottish Parliament reviewed its own budget setting process, and we were very much involved with that set of discussions, which led to another written agreement between the government and Parliament, which wrote our sort of role into that as well. And then I think also our first OECD review again recommended that we have much closer links with the Parliament, and that enabled those to be set up. It enabled the Parliament to sort of say, well, look, even though it's not in the legislation, we want you to do this work on fiscal sustainability. And so I think the role has developed partly, because of legislation, but other things as well. So in a sense, that's why doing early reviews and things like that, I think, is really helpful, because it just allows you to cement the relationship between Parliament and the Fiscal Council.
Okay. So just on your, I guess one of the most important manifestations of your reporting structure, or your how you're set up is around resources. Explain to us how your resources are allocated. Who provides your budget?
Do you want to?
Yeah. So this is set out in our framework agreement, which for every public body in Scotland, there's a framework agreement between the public body and Scottish ministers, which sets out the basics of the relationship between the two. And our framework agreement specifies that we have a rolling 3-year budget of sorts, that we will ask for funding over a 3-year window. Scottish ministers will give us a firm commitment about a year ahead, and that is included in the annual budget bill. And they will also give us an indication of the levels they'll fund us in years 2 and 3. So it's a rolling sort of window, and that's in line with the OECD principles, which sort of suggest you have that in order to stop the government cutting your funding off immediately. There's a recommendation in the last OECD review that we strengthen that and move to sort of not just sort of 1 + 2 indicative, but 3 actual years of funding, the same way that the new Chancellor of the Exchequer has agreed to fund the OBR. So it's much stronger than I got the sense that was proposed in your bill. And also because we're a separate public body, our finances are distinctly separate from the government. The government gives us allocation, it's up to us how we spend it. And again, that's enshrined in legislation, and there's a similar provision, I think, in your bill.
You are, just unpack that a bit more for us, if you would, either Professor Roy or John. That's there's a specific clause. You are a body corporate, which is distinct from, completely distinct from the Scottish the finance department of the Scottish government, or escapes me now the precise name of the Scottish government department. But they don't set your budget basically. There's a framework agreement, and you have some guarantee over multi-year funding, and that is, from your perspective, you've more independence and surety of funding than is provided for in our bill, is what you're saying?
Yes, I think that's a fair statement. Yes, we're formally a corporate body, and we're part of the Scottish administration, which means that we're not part of the Scottish government, but we are all civil servants. So the staff are civil servants. So that gives us quite a lot of independence from the government, and it gives us that sort of independence of funding and also how we use our budget. But ultimately, we are dependent upon Scottish ministers to agreeing to fund us to a certain level.
So it is still theoretically possible that I'm not sure this wouldn't happen, but it's theoretically legally possible for a minister to say, I'm just not going to give them a budget now. Obviously, there would be consequences for that, but that could there's nothing legally to prevent that happening.
Absolutely, and the alternative way of doing this. So, for example, our audit body, Audit Scotland, is set up in a different way. It's set up to be basically funded by the Scottish Parliament.
Indeed, yeah.
So there, the Parliament controls the purse strings. Still obviously subject to political control, but a different sort of political control. So they're the different models. And I remember the OECD has basically looked at all these across the world, and roughly half are funded in the way that we are by the executive, and half funded by the Parliament. So it's 50-50 in that sense.
It's 50-50 in terms of the number, but do you have a view on which is preferable? It's sort of, it may be 50-50 in terms of, in the world, the number of fiscal institutions that are funded by central government and the number that are funded by the Parliament or the legislature, but is it 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in terms of the actual outcome? Which do you think is better?
I think this one works better for us because the staff being civil servants means that we can operate in the same labour market as Scottish Government analysts, and we can offer, say, our staff a strong career path. The track record of the Scottish Government has been very good in terms of funding us. So we haven't had arguments about funding. They've basically given us what we've asked for. So far, I can't back on that. So I think in practical terms, it's worked well for us. You can envisage circumstances it wouldn't. But you can also envisage circumstances in which Parliament controlling wouldn't work either. So in practical terms, it's worked well for us. We quite like it. But I think it's very much a judgment call.
It's fair to say... Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think this is where the links on the funding are important to the other aspects of independence of the bill. So, for example, because we have that reporting into the Finance Committee, and I've been quite clear that, and I'm more than happy to always answer a question from the Finance Committee about our funding. So we go along to our Finance Committee every year, and we give an assessment about governance and how activities are going. And because I'm an independent commissioner, if I ever had any concerns about the funding of how we're being funded or how we're being interacted with the government, that would be the point I would raise it. And because that's so transparent and that's there's a check and a balance into that. And as John said, the benefit of being within that broader Scottish Government aspect of it is quite useful for small organisations rather than having to do absolutely everything yourself. So we get the benefits of being in there, but I think also we've got that independence, which is ultimately the most important bit.
Yeah, and of course you have the added independence, which isn't in our bill, which is the appointment. Is it both yourself, Professor Roy, as chair? Is the chief executive? Is that appointment subject to approval by the Parliament, or is it just the members of the commission, as it were?
Yeah, so the commissioners are the ones that are appointed by Parliament, and then chief executive and all these appointments would be typical civil service appointments.
Great, okay.
Into that.
Okay.
But civil service appointments controlled by commissioners.
Yes, okay. Fair enough. So that makes sense. Right, now, just in relation to the bill, your own bill, there's a line in there which caught my eye, which is slightly different from what we have, which is basically, obviously, you have additional powers which we, as it were, don't need yet because limited fiscal devolution. So we don't need lots of forecasting powers around revenue, for example. But there's a question, there's a description here which is about the reasonableness of Scottish ministers. You're asked to make a judgment about the reasonableness of Scottish ministers' assumptions. What does that mean? I know there's a lot of an entire universe of jurisprudence on the word reasonable, but what does it mean in your world?
So that's quite a narrow clause, actually. It refers to the reasonableness of the government's borrowing plans.
Okay.
So the Scottish Government can borrow on resource and day-to-day expenditure to cover forecast error. It has a limited power there, but it can. And then it has slightly more generous, but still quite limited powers on capital borrowing. Okay. And each fiscal event, we are required to sort of say, we think the assumptions that the government are working on are reasonable, they make sense. And also the plans coming out of, plans for borrowing coming out of that are sensible as well. So basically, it just allows us to sort of make a judgment, or requires us to make a judgment on these borrowing plans. But because the government's powers are quite limited, on the face of it, it's a very limited requirement. We, however, have used that to say, well, look, the extent of how much you need to borrow depends on your spending plans. So that allows us to think about the government's spending plans in general as well. So we tend to produce in our forecast publications, we tend to produce a little bit of narrative about spending plans, how they sit relative to funding, and the gap between the two. So it's very much in that sort of space, but it is relatively constrained.
Okay. But there is also, I mean, there's also, I think, so I'm looking at the reasonableness appears also when it comes to forecast assumptions and projection relating to such fiscal matters as considers appropriate. But you've given us a useful explanation there. The other question I was going to ask is around forecasting. Clause 2 of your legislation obliges you to produce forecasts on the devolved taxes, but also other, as it were, ascertainable revenue, VAT, income tax. Are there any taxes? So when it comes to VAT, there, you're making a forecast of Scottish VAT receipts over a 5-year period. We don't yet have anywhere near the level of fiscal devolution of Scotland. We may never have. But one question I have asked is whether we should bake in at least the power to do economic forecasting. And obviously you're also obliged to, if I'm understanding this correctly, you are obliged to create a GDP forecast excluding oil and gas. Is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Do you think, I mean, one argument made back to us has been, we don't think it's worth the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council doing forecasting of GDP or economic forecasting yet, in part because there's no political agreement or even defined policy on further fiscal devolution. Do you find the economic forecasting bit of your job useful for other work in addition to just the devolved taxation piece?
Yeah. So I would say so. So a couple of bits in there about the forecasting tax. So essentially what we do is forecast the taxes and the social security elements that are devolved. That's a devolved taxes, but also income tax, because even though that's not devolved in the sense that it's still collected by HMRC,
the part itself can be varied.
It's part of the devolved public finances. So we do the forecast for that. VAT is something that was recommended in the Smith Commission, right, but it has not been devolved. It was only ever planned to be the assignment of VAT rather than the actual devolution of VAT. So in other words, we would estimate a proportion of the revenues that would have been collected from VAT in Scotland, and that would flow into the budget. We may come on to that, but that's the assignment of VAT immediately gets into some really quite technical issues about how do you measure how much VAT has been collected in Scotland when you have essentially businesses operating all across the UK. So it's a very technical. It's proven to be very technically difficult to do, and that's largely been delayed, and we await further details from the government about when and if that would ever come in. We also, as you say,
Crystallise that, sorry, for the purpose of our record. You do basically forecast Scottish VAT receipts, even though there's no current plan to devolve VAT to Scotland.
We'll do it illustrative. We don't do them every single time. We'll do an illustrative estimate because that is ultimately something that would potentially come down the line. But we don't do, for example, the really deep dive forecasts into what we do around income tax, etc., which will have an impact immediately on the next year's budget.
Okay. Right, I'll let you go.
Yeah. So on the point about the economy, again, it's quite interesting. One of the reasons why we were essentially set up to forecast on the economy was explicitly linked to the fiscal framework, which had in there in its original draft for Scotland a mechanism that would unlock additional borrowing flexibilities in the instance of what was called an asymmetric shock. And that was where essentially there was a difference in the forecast for ourselves and the OBR for the UK that suggested that Scotland was in a different economic position within the cycle compared to the UK. That was done in the initial fiscal framework. It was largely, I think, reviewed as being not that effective, and the borrowing flexibilities increased anyway, so that now no longer exists in the detail of the fiscal framework. However, I think the benefit of being able to forecast the economy independently and to write up the outlook for the economy, I think is really important for several reasons. First of all, it's a regular, independent stress test of how the economy is doing, which I think is quite important. It gets that regularity in there, it gets Parliament talking about it, it improves the public debate. Second, we don't just focus GDP. By having to forecast GDP, you're then looking into things like earnings, you're then looking into things like living standards, you're then looking into things like unemployment, and I think it facilitates a much broader debate about wider public policy. We might not then take it into public policy, but the fact is there's a big evidence base there that people can use. And then the third bit is that evidence base, by not just looking at quarterly GDP, but looking at things like demographics or looking at things like climate change. What we can then do is then provide an evidence base that other people can then start to look at and say, well, there's a really big challenge in Scotland of an ageing population, and we've now got this robust set of data from the Fiscal Commission. How do we then feed that into the work of Public Health Scotland or the work of government or the scrutiny of Parliament? So I think that evidence base by the work that we do on the economy and forecasting and doing these projections generates a lot of benefits beyond simply being asked to do it for this asymmetric shock element which no longer exists.
And just before I move on to other members, on the specific point about resourcing internally and your staffing complement for that, is it possible to say how many additional people you have working on that, or is it difficult to disaggregate? So how many people would you not need if you were to strip out your economic forecasting responsibilities, if that's a question?
Our economy team consists of 2 people with input from a third member of the SNT. So it's a relatively small team. We've built our own macro model for Scotland in eViews, which is a standard software package. So it's quite straightforward to run the economy forecasts. But it is quite a scarce skill set as well. So
Indeed.
Finding the people to do it is hard.
Indeed. Okay. I think that's extremely useful. I would just make the observation that our policy debate, when it comes to devolved policies, we barely ever end up talking about the economic consequences. Sometimes we'll talk about the fiscal consequence, i.e. what something would cost, but we're rarely talking about what it would raise, because we raise very few revenues, but we rarely talk about the economic consequences of, so for example, the Communities Minister was announcing Job Start things, Job Start policy the other day, whether clearly some merit in them, other questions to be asked about them, but we don't really, as he was effectively saying in the chamber, any economic benefit generated for Northern Ireland is not directly going to come back to us, and there's a way. I think there is an argument for making that more a part of our debate, the actual economic consequences of decisions. So that's an observation to make, but thank you very much. I'm just going to move on to other members now. Thank you, Deputy Chair, first Diane Forsyth.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for joining us today. We're obviously at the opportunity when we're building something new to learn from others, and really appreciate you taking the time here. Some of my concerns around this legislation and bringing forward the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council bill is making sure that it sets itself apart with enough independence, and you've spoke a little to that today in terms of how the way you sits a little bit more like the way we would have the likes of our audit office or our NIPSO, and they're reporting into the Assembly through our audit committee rather than sitting within the Department of Finance. So personally I would have just concerns that whenever this comes forward, that it's seen as another branch of the Department of Finance, and as the Chair says, we want to make sure that we're affording enough powers that our entire economic outcomes and societal outcomes, the whole wider piece is captured there, and that obviously is the intention of everyone with it, but we don't want to see any limitations coming through in our legislation from it. And I'm just looking, your framework document there is 2019, and I just wanted to ask, in terms of yourselves, is this kept live? Is it live under review? Are you feeding back under what's going well, what's not going well? Have you had any amendments since yours came into play? Because I would hope that our own, we would have it in the best shape possible, but just thinking about how things may evolve over time, I would be keen to hear how things have gone for yourself since that was initially established.
Okay, the framework, it's interesting that you note the date of the framework document. So we were set up, our Act was passed in 2016, we were set up in 2017, and the framework agreement wasn't signed until, you say, 2019. And the reason for that was that we were very clear that we wanted our multi-year funding settlement to be set in that framework document. So that explains why there's a bit of delay in publishing that framework agreement. We're in the process this year of actually revising the framework document, and some of those things, also the stuff in the framework document is quite procedural, and we're tweaking that. But the major thing we're thinking about is the OECD review, our last OECD review, which recommended that the multi-year agreement on funding is strengthened to improve our independence. So the conversations we're having with the Scottish Government now about the framework document, framework agreement, are basically in that space of how can we improve and strengthen that multi-year agreement in line with the OECD review recommendation. And that's still in progress. Those conversations are happening at the moment.
And is your framework or guidelines, are they referenced in your legislation?
A framework document is something which all public bodies in Scotland are required to have. So it's covered by public body legislation rather than our own act.
Yeah, no, it's something maybe it'd be worth us teasing out in terms of what that means for us here. I was really interested in there, pardon me, in your comments around trying to isolate the figures for just Scotland when you're talking about things like VAT. It's a really, really important point, because obviously so many of our companies are operating right throughout the United Kingdom, Republic of Ireland, and further afield. So to be able to extract any of those things, is difficult. And I just wondered, is there any either formal or informal way that yourselves and all of the fiscal commissions maybe would profile work together in terms of, Westminster, other bodies, as to what you can put together for a picture right across the United Kingdom, and if it's something that we should be considering as the Northern Ireland one's formed, what the relationship is in terms of working, because it would be good to get the reciprocal reporting on a number of those things.
So I maybe say a couple of things. John might want to add in some bits as well. I think we don't take a view on what taxes should be devolved. We take a view that once these taxes have been devolved, what do we look at? So I think the debate about what taxes are easier from an administrative point of view to devolve versus ones which are more difficult is a step before it comes to us. So things like things like property taxes, like our land and building transaction tax, from an administrative point of view, is relatively easy to devolve, in the sense that there's a geographical boundary you can measure it in, so it's quite straightforward. Similar in income tax, it gets a bit more complicated in income tax, but all taxpayers in Scotland now have an S in our tax code, that if we live and work in Scotland, then we're now identified as being Scottish taxpayers. The minute you get into the business tax world, so corporation taxes, VAT, on consumers, but also on spending more generally, that's where it gets more difficult about how you measure it. And that's where the issues around VAT assignment are still working through about, is it possible to come up with a robust estimate of how much VAT is being collected within a geographical boundary. The point about working with the fiscal councils, yeah, as you can imagine, this is quite a unique club of people that work in this area. So we have a really good working relationship with the OBR. The OBR also do work for Wales, and obviously colleagues in the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, where we get together on a regular basis and we discuss areas that we're working on and we learn from them. So, for example, as I mentioned, we've learned quite a bit from colleagues in the Northern Ireland about the work they've been doing around the long-term public spending projections linked to demographics. We've learned from the OBR and the work around climate change. So there's a bit of interaction and sharing, and we kind of share ideas and issues as they come up.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear you're working together. I just was wondering what your view was and whether there should be just sort of any kind of formal recognition of the need to work together, but I think just even the fact that you are initially working together is welcome.
Yes, I would add, so we have much more formal arrangements around data access to things like government, and we have more kind of areas where there's, through our protocols and through our statement of data needs, where more, not less in the federal councils, but more in terms of government, about where we'll set out what we need to do our work. And again, this comes back, I think, to the important point, I think, about independence being what's written down, but also how you behave and act as an institution. So one of the most powerful elements that we do, I think, to protect our independence, but also to get what we need from government to do our work, is that every second year we publish a statement of data needs, and we publish that and we go and give evidence to that and to our finance committee. And that essentially sets out what we need in order to do our job. But because it's public and because we engage with the committee, it becomes a really good way of us getting the information that we need. The government could tell us to go away or not actually respond to it, but because it's done quite publicly and because it's done as a genuinely, this is the ask, this is what we need, then we find it actually works as a really effective mechanism to get the data and the insights that we're required to do our job.
Thank you.
Could I just ask on cooperation, that our Act contains a duty to cooperate with the Office of Budget Responsibility, so there's a legislative requirement to do this. It's a very simple clause to insert.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Brian Kingston's next, Brian.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your time today and for the benefit of your operation in Scotland. I expect if you came to work for the Fiscal Council of Northern Ireland, you would be frustrated by the restricted financial powers here compared to what you have, the level of devolution in Scotland. But it is important to have this independent body in terms of public confidence in the figures being provided by government. I'm interested that you provide the official forecast of the economy and for government income in Scotland. You're not. Can you say a wee bit more about how you have tried to avoid straying into the political sphere, about not commenting on what government policy is, but yet I presume at some stage, if you were alarmed by financial forecasts, I mean, we had not so long ago at UK government level where the alarm bells were ringing in a particular government's forecasts, and so how you, without going into the political sphere, how you would raise concerns if you feel that government plans are not adding up and will be damaging for the economy?
Yeah. So it's a really good question, and a couple of things I'll say, maybe John might want to come in as well. So the first thing is, I think we've spoken about independence and about our independence from government and our ability to do our work in a way which is our views and our analysis. it's also really important that that independence means that we are independent and that we have to take that responsibility we have exceptionally seriously, and it's very precious to us. And as I mentioned, the independence of the institution is the most important thing for the Fiscal Council. So the onus is really on us not to get involved in clear political debates, or not to make any comments about party politics or political decisions, because if we lose our independence or lose our perception of independence, then that's a real challenge. And that comes back to very careful about who you appoint, what processes you've got in place, about your publications, and what's the process of identifying errors, mistakes that we might make, and things. So the independence goes both ways. A couple of bits about how we do it and how we operate in practice. So the first of all is that we only model policies that the government are essentially announcing or implementing. So we don't model hypotheticals from opposition parties, for example. We don't do, well, if you'd done this, you could have got this outcome. We just essentially will forecast, if you want to put a penny on income tax, or you want to introduce a new social security payment, how much is this going to cost, and what's the assessment? What will the effects of that be in terms of the economy or revenues? We don't tend to comment on outcomes, for example, so we won't tend to have a subjective judgment about this is a good outcome or this is a bad outcome. And we keep it very much to the analysis and the rigor there. But that doesn't mean that we shy away from commenting about where we think there are highlighting issues. So what we tend to do is highlight a particular issue and say this is a debate that Parliament needs to discuss. So for example, we've done quite a lot of work recently looking at a gap that is emerging between the Scottish Government's social security spending commitments and the funding that is flowing through for that. Now, it's not our judgment to say whether that's a good idea, whether spending more on social security is a good or bad thing. But what we can do is we can pose some questions, and we can highlight how the fact that this is potentially meaning impacts on spending elsewhere, that this is potentially leading to difficult choices for the government, that the government might want to think about what its evidence base is for this assessment over the long term. And we also then throw it back to opposition parties as well and say, well, if you're going to offer alternative suggestions, you need to think about where the monies are going to be saved. So we spend quite a lot of time being quite careful about our language that we use and trying to essentially highlight issues, offer probing questions that government and opposition parties need to respond to, but being very clear that ultimately decisions about policies are up to government and up to the policymakers themselves.
Thank you. One other question, Chair, if I may. We've had debate about, in the OECD submission to us, we've had debate about the appointment process, and we've actually scored lowly on that in terms of a merit-based approach. That it seems that our members are pretty much going to be appointed by the Minister. So that's been highlighted, that there's a lack of, as I say, merit-based leadership and merit-based staff selection. So that's one of the, we've had debate about that. In your own commission, I think you said the members are appointed by the ministers, but there was another level as well in the appointment of members of the commission?
Yeah, so what happens, we've actually just gone through a recruitment process for our commissioners, and so essentially what would happen there is that the emerging age commissioners will advertise for new commissioners. Typically I would lead the process for looking to recruit. What I do is I chair a panel, and we would involve, the panel would be mixture of myself, relevant colleagues in government, someone from the ethical standards, is that the full title?
Yes.
The title, Ethical Standards Commission. So there's someone there to look after the fit and proper test and principles of public life, and then an independent member, someone completely separate from government and the Fiscal Commission. And we would have a panel, we advertise, we then interview, and we have a merit-based interview. Then what would happen is I then make a recommendation to the minister. Based on that, then the minister makes a decision, but then crucially, the minister then makes a recommendation to Parliament. What would typically happen then would be is that the people who've been recommended would go along and give evidence to the Finance Committee, and they would go through like almost like a second interview stage after the formal stage with me and colleagues to a session with Parliament, and then Parliament, the Finance Committee would then make a recommendation to the main body of the Chamber, and the Chamber would then vote on that recommendation, and then that would then go back to the Minister to make an appointment. So as John said, the involvement in Parliament is a really important bit, because Parliament can obviously influence the decision. I think, speaking frankly, as someone who's been involved in it and gone through it, I really valued that process to engage with the Finance Committee, because I certainly felt that so much of what we do is about trying to bring rigour and independence and impartiality into the budget process. So by being able to go and give evidence to the Finance Committee and then almost get their kind of blessing or their sign off that they had to trust in me to do that, actually then gives me confidence to then actually engage in the work as a commissioner. So I think the Parliament bit is important from a process point of view, but it's also, I think, a really important practical point of view as well about how we work as a commission.
Could I just add something on the statutory basis of that? So there are two statutory bases for that process of appointing our commissioners. The first is general public body legislation, which requires that all board members of public bodies in Scotland are appointed through an open and fair competition. So there's that already. And then our own statute, our own Fiscal Commission Act, requires that sort of additional thing of the parliamentary approval. So there's something about how public bodies are run in Scotland, which is statutory, about open and fair competition, and the additional power that Parliament has to approve our appointments. If you look at the OBR, so the UK body, the UK Fiscal Council, it has exactly the same process that, very, very similar process that open and fair commission and appointments and competition, and then confirmation hearings by the appropriate select committee in the House of Commons. So again, that's similar two-stage process, but open and fair competition underpins both.
Okay, no, that's very helpful. Okay, thank you.
Okay, just very briefly, I'm going to bring in Deirdre now, but just very briefly, you mentioned commentary on statements made by the opposition. Now, I'm tempted to say asking for a friend before I ask this question, but are you obliged under the law to have any particular commentary on opposition proposals or cost opposition proposals, but it's just something that you do?
We don't. We explicitly don't. So our legislation limits us to only comment on government policy and forecast a government policy. So we don't forecast any alternative policies, whether that be from opposition parties or whether it be from think tanks or even our own ideas. We don't do that at all. We explicitly just focus on government.
You did say something about You did say something about making comment on or commenting on opposition proposals. Is that something you might do in commentary? Is that what you said? No,
typically no.
I misheard you
So
there.
we wouldn't.
Not doing so?
Yes, we would comment on. So what we do is we would comment on government policies, and we talk about these are the trade-offs that you might want to do. What we typically do, and I think this is a comment you're picking up, what we would also do is that we would make general statements about saying, in order to understand this, in order to understand that, say, the spending commitments that government are doing, if you're going to suggest alternatives, you need to come up with, scenarios about where other elements are going to come through because we work on the budget. So we would try and make general comments to try and improve the quality of the debate. So rather than asking people just to keep, encouraging people to keep totting up, this is what other things that we would do. But we wouldn't go into any specifics about what that would look like.
I heard that, so I wanted to clarify. Brian, I'll happily put in your pigeonhole all our policy papers so you can read them for
your own homework.
Your Christmas. I'm going to bring in Deirdre now. Deirdre.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for the update so far, and some of the questions I was going to ask has been answered, but I suppose it was just on your data sharing or access arrangements with the OBR. I mean, obviously we work on an island here as well, so of course we'll have the east-west relationships. Obviously we get the block grant from Westminster, but we also have north-south relationships on the island as well. And it's just from your own experience around, are there additions then in terms of data sharing and access that you feel that we would need to consider in the context that we're working, you know, on an island-based economy, but obviously those east-west relationships as well. The other bit I wanted to ask as well was around the external review. And obviously, I know in the report there back in March from the OECD, it said that one of the critical functions of the council was about empowering public and political understanding of Scotland's fiscal challenges. But I had a broader concern and issue around, I suppose, the independence, but also the makeup of the council in Scotland. And just, do you provide analysis just on fiscal policy, or do you look at the equity issue and the social outcomes as well? And I suppose that feeds in for me in terms of the independence, but also the makeup of the fiscal council, you know, recruitment. Are you as representative of Scottish society? I just seen a recent article in The Guardian around private schools and their influence on British society more broadly, where they only make up 7% of the population, yet in a lot of the key jobs and sectors in Britain, they represent over 50% of those areas of employment, and particularly in decision making. So I just wondered, from any of the review beyond creating that broader fiscal understanding, whether you prompt or to get society and the politicians to think more broadly in terms of equity and social outcomes. And if so, is there any more, you know, how are you made up as a council in terms of those with a workers' rights background, a working class background? So I would just like a bit more information on those aspects of work, please. Thank you.
Great. I'll make some general comments, and John, if you want to come in on some of the specifics about how we make the appointments. On the point about the data that we get and how we use that data, so obviously Scotland's different from Northern Ireland, so essentially our funding mechanism is purely driven by the combination of the Westminster Block Grant, then the devolved taxes, and then the taxes that are shared between ourselves and the UK, which is mainly income tax. I mean, so that on the fiscal stuff is relatively limited in that context. We have to do quite a lot. The way the complex of this fiscal framework works for Scotland, there's a lot of complexities in there about decisions taken in England and Wales that then have a funding implication for Scotland, and we've got to understand those for our commentary and our analysis. We might not make these forecasts, but we've got to understand these dynamics in order to then update what the overall budget position, or what our understanding of the budget position would be. And that broadens out a lot when you start to think about the economy, because clearly understanding what are the factors that might impact on the Scottish economy, we don't just look at what's happening in England and Wales. We have to look at what's happening more broadly across Europe and globally, and factor all of those in there as well. So for that, we tend not to have to worry too much about a data sharing arrangement, because a lot of that is just about our own intelligence gathering and understanding about how different global effects might impact us. So for example, we've done some work recently about what tariffs might mean for the Scottish economy, and we can take, you know, global evidence, our own modelling, to come up with an assessment about what that means for Scotland. I appreciate in the case of Northern Ireland, it's going to be much more complex, because there's many more links that are there, which we need to understand. So understanding, for example, how the Irish economy might perform over the next few years will have an impact of what matters for what might happen and the spillovers into all of that. That's not something that we have to worry about, because we'd be assessing what might be happening at the rest of the UK spilling over, but that's largely contained within the work that we do. And on the point about recruitment and how we get our commissioners into that, as John said, we run we're in an open and fair competition. So what we do is have a skill set, and given that a lot of our work is around modelling or forecasting or understanding the tax system or understanding the different elements of that, that's naturally where our skill sets and where our the job description would particularly focus upon. John said we then go through all the various formal processes around public appointments to make sure they're balanced, and we're accounting for various protective characteristics and the like. And we've changed. It's quite interesting. We've evolved quite a lot as an institution over the last 10 years or so because of our remit. So initially, when we were set up, the focus was very much on a more academic economics type skill set that was embedded into and full disclosure, I'm an academic economist, so that was very much the focus that was going down. But actually, we've evolved a lot, particularly around our move into things like much more in taxation and much more social security. So we have just appointed 2 new commissioners. I think the press release is out today. Is that right? So I can reveal this. I'm not going to get myself in trouble. But we've just appointed 2 new commissioners today. Eleanor Ryan, who is someone with a public finance background, and Justine Ricomini, who's got a tax background, are the 2 new commissioners that have come in. So we've gone from being 4 academic economists to being a broader mix of people with an economics background and people with a tax and a spending background. And that's largely driven by our skills need and what we need to do our work. And the final piece, I think, more broadly about what we focus upon and what we look at, again, we've moved on quite a lot. So our legislation is quite restricted into things like forecasting the economy, forecasting taxes, forecasting social security, and we keep within our lane, and we don't move out of that. However, though, a lot of the work that we're doing around things like fiscal sustainability is moving us into worlds like, we've done a lot of work around demographics and ill health, which gets into health inequality issues and how do we understand those. We've done a lot of work on climate change and understanding about climate change and what the effects might be of that. And we do a lot more on things like social security and the impacts of poverty. But just to be clear, what our remit is very clear about what we do is we don't look at these issues, and we're not allowed to look at these issues for a particular outcome. What we do is look at them from the public finance perspective. So on climate change, we're just looking at what might be the fiscal costs of mitigation and moving towards net zero, what might be the fiscal costs of damage from climate change, but we wouldn't make an analysis of looking at climate change per se. Our remit only lets us look at the public finance consequences of that, and similarly for things like inequality and ill health.
Sorry, can I come back in just on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks for that update. And I suppose, that's why I'm asking, because obviously fiscal policy can direct social outcomes one way or the other. And I suppose what I wanted to know is that being analysed in terms of distributional impacts, in terms of fiscal policy, and how that does have an impact in terms of health inequality, or as you say, in terms of social security, which obviously then, and when you go round again full circle, it has a fiscal impact in terms of budgets and how that's spent, or even, as you say, the climate challenges going forward, or an ageing population, which is going to dramatically change by 2040 in terms of that longer term planning. So I suppose that's why it feeds in around how representative the Fiscal Council is. So I'm not saying you don't need academics and those, with a financial expertise, but it's also looking more long term in terms of social policy, in terms of whether that's workers' rights issues, because this is ultimately going to have an impact then in terms of the economy and in terms of fiscal policy. So, and managing budgets. So it's just, is there work, or has any of this come up in your OECD review that's been done in terms of making sure that those distributional impacts of the economy are being looked at? Because obviously, when you see the whole issue even around immigration and all of that, and I think this is important because it's part of that public debate, that the public are informed of these issues, and that was one of the areas that come up in your own review there back in March. To make sure that the public and the politics have a greater understanding of fiscal challenges. but I don't think that can be detached from the social challenges that are presented. And just, you know, how do we make sure that we're informing the public? And what greater role, I suppose, could a council like yourselves and the one that we want to put on a firm statutory footing, what more can we do to ensure that it's representative of the society out there more broadly in order that we can buy them in and inform them? And I suppose that was one of the things as well around how you consult them, because obviously the only people I would imagine that engage with yourselves, you know, would be academics or those involved in business. So how do you engage or consult with the wider public in terms of building that public awareness and confidence in what you're doing? And even in, I suppose, in how you disseminate information, is it in an easily read type of document, you know, that community workers, the trade unions, that Joe Public can just lift and kind of absorb?
So it's a really good question. So a couple of things I would say. So first of all, we are limited in the remit of what we work on, and part of the thing might be to think about, well, what do you want a fiscal council to do? There is merit in having a fiscal council in some ways being quite narrowly targeted on doing a small number of things, because it means that you can really be clear about your independence, what you should be doing, and what is straying outside your area. But a couple of things I would say though. So first of all, we are, again, the OCD recommending this, and we're really, really clear. Again, part of our recruitment of our commissioners was really designed to do this, is how do we open up broader conversations and move into areas of real genuine interest. So climate change being a really good example of that, where we've proactively said we think climate change is something that's really, really important for people to understand on the public finances. So therefore we're going to do work and look into it. Things like poverty and inequality being the same as well. So we're very much open to that, about even though we've got to remain in our lane, about moving into those areas and how we can facilitate a conversation about that. The broader point though, and I think this is something to perhaps bear in mind and to consider as part of this bill, is how much of this has to be done by a fiscal council, or how much is this done within the broader public policy architecture that exists within the country. So while we might not do explicit work, you know, looking at some of the policy agendas within all the different areas, what we do is very proactively partner with similar bodies and institutions who are working in this area. So we'll go out and engage with local government, with various commissioners in Scotland. So there's things like a children's rights commissioner. Our colleagues were at an event in the last week looking at human rights budgeting, and we'll engage with trade unions. We'll engage with third sector organisations, think tanks, communities. We'll go and talk to and engage with all these organisations. But it's then we're not the experts in those areas. So what we do is we bring our expertise to talk about the public finance issues, to then hopefully help inform their work. And they're the better ones to go and take that work forward in particular areas. So I think within your thinking about what you want from your fiscal council, I think it's important to think about, well, what other aspects of the landscape do you want to have in place so that you can actually address all the various issues that you're looking, whether that be in the economy, whether that be on business, or whether that be on human rights budgeting, or tackling poverty, or social inclusion, or climate change. The fiscal council can be one part of it. It doesn't have to do all of them, but it's how it then supports the various activities that it does. And that's one of the things that the OECD have recommended we do much more in. We engage more, we do more communications, we get out there a bit more and talk about this work. But ultimately, we wouldn't be the experts in talking about climate change or an aspect like that.
Thank you.
You happy enough, Judy? Yeah. And just to say, obviously, if these things we want to put these things in the bill, if the minister had wanted to put in the bill, they could be put in the bill. If any member wishes to make an amendment, these additional powers can be put on the bill and then debated, and so I think that's worth us noting that. But we'll bring in Owen Tennyson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that evidence so far. And I guess my question builds on where Deirdre left off. And that is, obviously, you've talked about the way in which the role of the Scottish Commission has evolved over time and has looked at issues like climate change and gone above and beyond in terms of its engagement with the Scottish Parliament. Scottish legislation obviously contains provision which would allow the government to modify the functions of the Commission. Has the Commission ever made proposals, or has there been any public debate in Scotland about additional functions that could or should be added? Conscious that we in Northern Ireland would have an opportunity to do that now at this stage.
In terms of remits of the Scottish Fiscal Commission about what we do.
Yes.
Yeah. So typically, I mean, John might know about the broader debate. We tend not to get involved in the debate about asking for more things, largely because, again, it's about protecting our kind of independence in that regard. So we wouldn't tend to say, well, we would want a reform in a particular area, because that ultimately is for the policymakers to do. We'll do whatever we do, what our legislation is done, set out, and then we'll respond and we'll pick up any tasks or what that we've been commissioned to do. A lot of the changes that have happened have largely come through, as John was saying, about essentially us growing organically within as an organisation. So we've got a line in our legislation, the exact wording, I think it's called fiscal factors. We can comment on fiscal factors, and that's the thing we've been able to use to develop our work in climate change and to develop our work in fiscal sustainability. So we didn't need to change the legislation, but actually we can then use organically, again, through our independence, their engagement with the committee, and also demonstrating value for government, that these are areas that we can move into. But ultimately, it'll be up to government if they want to change us in any way. If they want to do it, then pushing that through a change in legislation and Parliament voting for that. And we would tend not to get, we would not get involved in that. That would be against our independence.
Yeah. And could I add that our formal remit has been changed once. It was a minor change to tidy up some of the original legislation in terms of the social security spending that we had to forecast. So you can change some of those terms just by sort of statutory instrument, and that happened. It was a very minor but useful change, and we talked to the government about that because the original legislation was a bit clunky. So it's quite a small change. Our remit, our de facto remit, what we actually do has evolved, as Graham was saying, over time, but that's principally been on the back of the 2 OECD reviews. So the first OECD review recommended that we start work on long-term fiscal sustainability. The Finance Committee picked that up and also made the same recommendation, and we used that to, using the powers that Graham described, to start that work. And the latest OECD review has made a similar recommendation about looking at more spending analysis.
That's helpful. Just in terms of your budget and how you're funded then, I mean, often in Northern Ireland at times of fiscal constraint, our departments will be told to prioritise their statutory responsibilities. Have you ever felt or faced any pressure to focus only on those statutory functions set out in legislation as opposed to those additional pieces of work that you're taking forward?
Each year we have a conversation with the government about sort of how much money we are asking for, and each year part of that conversation takes account of sort of efficiency savings, and certainly we have offered, as we've developed over time, we need less resource to do forecasting work because our models are now bedded in, and we transferred that resource to our additional functions. So we've been very careful to think carefully about efficiencies and redeployment of staff. The government so far have been very reasonable and haven't pushed back on how much we've asked for, particularly in terms of those additional functions. The climate in Scotland is tighter this year, and we haven't really gone through our funding process for this year, so that's to be seen.
I mean, if I could add two things that are quite important. Again, part of this is, I think part of the whole point about this is a trade-off between having a budget that is directly from government or one that is separate from that. I mean, I've always been quite relaxed about the budget from government because ultimately, as a public body and as a public finance body, we understand the public finance climate, or we should do it. So we understand the challenges that exist there. And secondly, as well, ultimately it comes, I think there's an important kind of accountability for us as well, that we have to be demonstrating value for money. We have to be doing the things that are interesting. We have to be contributing value and that really matters when we go and give evidence to committee and we have feedback from government. But one subtle point that John mentioned, which is really important, is that while we get the budget from the government, the total amount, it's entirely up to us to decide how we spend that. It's not for government to determine how to do that. And that's a really important part of being an independent fiscal institution, that we can essentially determine how we want to spend that money. So if we want to do X, or we want to do Y, want to do more in communications or less in communications, that's ultimately a decision that is ours. And we're not having to report to government on what we do.
No, thanks for that. That's very useful. And just one final question for me is the Scottish legislation includes a duty to cooperate with the Office for Budget Responsibility. I'm just wondering, what does that look like in practice? Is that mostly around the economic forecasting, or what does that entail?
It entails really not so much the economic forecasting, but more of the devolved taxes. So the OBR has a responsibility to forecast all taxes in the UK, including devolved taxes in Scotland. So basically, we share our models and our working, and we even do forecast runs for the OBR on things like the Scottish property taxes, Scottish domestic rates, and things like that. So that's very much that sort of cooperation from us to them, and in return they share information with us on their social security forecasts in particular, and some of the background and the legal material that they have about how DWP operates helps us in our forecasts of social security as well.
Okay, that's useful. I'm not sure if there's an equivalent provision in the draft Fiscal Council bill, but thank you for that.
No
That's my
explicit
question.
thing in there. There's a section under.
This committee brought up.
It says. No, it doesn't have a specific provision in there. Brian Kingston wanted to come back in, I think, for something else.
Yep. Just briefly, earlier when we talked about the appointment of the commissioners, you set out a lengthy process. When you look at the framework document from 2019, it's quite brief. It just says they'll be appointed by the ministers with approval of the government. So in terms of us, the bill that we have before us, which just says that the members of our council would be appointed by the department. Just to know, was the appointment process in your original bill as brief as you laid out, or did it give a bit more detail about an open and fair competition? I mean, was that process added later by the government?
No. It's because there's other legislation in Scotland covering all public bodies, and that covers the appointments process for members of public body boards in Scotland. So that's the stuff which has the open competition in. And all our Act does is basically just add the requirement that ministerial appointments have to be approved by Parliament.
Yeah. Okay.
So in order to, and we can sort of talk to the clerks about that if this is helpful. We can find the other piece of legislation and try and get that to you if you'd like that.
Yeah. If no, it's useful, that would be helpful. Yeah. Just so we can see that there are statutory requirements in the appointment process. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We'll do that.
Thank you very much. One final, I suppose, slightly cheeky question from me is really around not specifically around the statutory provisions or the respective bills, but a lot of what we have been scrutinising since last February is our new fiscal framework, which is in some ways modelled on or a successor to the Smith process, and then what happened, and then the Holtham process in Wales. And obviously, the Fiscal Commission, Scottish Fiscal Commission, is a product of Smith, and all of that. If I can ask, what do you make of the debate? To the extent that you followed it, you might not have a view, but what do you make about the debate we're having here? So we're in a debate about calculation of need, and there is still some form of ongoing conversation between the Department of Finance here and the Treasury, specifically how agriculture spending is accounted for in a calculation of need. We have a slightly different model of, for example, land ownership and family farms. And anyway, so I don't know if you have any specific observations to make on. I'm not asking to provide an alternative calculation of Northern Ireland's relative need, Professor Roy, but any observations you'd make from Scotland on what you see here?
So I think maybe some general comments. I mean, I think the one thing that's quite clear about the devolution across the UK is that while there can be lessons learned from the fiscal frameworks are always going to be quite different because of the different contexts and the different issues. And yes, there are similarities in terms of devolution between Scotland and Northern Ireland, but also quite significant differences. There are also quite significant differences economically. We touched on earlier between north-south as well as east-west, so that the economic conditions look radically different as well. So I think there can be some learning from fiscal frameworks, but some differences too. Again, I mean, you mentioned that. So the debate and the motivation around the fiscal framework for Scotland was all driven by how might the Scottish Parliament get greater fiscal autonomy, and what additional tax powers could be devolved, and what additional social security powers could be devolved. That was the motivation for the debate. And need wasn't an issue in it at all, and needs never comes up as a particular issue in that context. I appreciate in Northern Ireland it's quite different. It's much more about that assessment within need there, and that's where it's quite different between the two systems. So, for example, we don't really do anything about assessment of need. We take the Barnett formula and the allocation as given, and then we do our analysis in the back of that. We don't do analysis about whether it should be bigger or smaller.
Okay, that's helpful, and thank you for giving us a view. And interesting and also diplomatic, which is good. It's a useful skill in your role too. Okay, thank you very much. We really appreciate both yourself, Professor Roy, and indeed John coming and giving us evidence. Your time is very valuable, and you've made time for us, and you've also given us lots of food for thought that will help us. So thank you genuinely very much. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll engage on other matters as we do with our colleagues at Holyrood on an ongoing basis. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thanks.
Okay, members, in my speaking notes. Thank you. So, members, I don't think we particularly need any follow-up information, but obviously that's a really useful evidence session. I'm sure it's provoked thought for members in terms of scrutiny of the bill. Certainly specific things occur to me that I think we'll want to bear in mind going forward. The fact that they were quite clear about the fact that they have a little bit more of an explicit relationship to the Parliament, albeit the Scottish Government still provide their budget. There is a more they have more forecasting power. I thought there was some very interesting comments on why forecasting powers themselves are useful for the broader purpose of some of the points Deirdre was making around the average person being engaged in the quite techy things that fiscal councils and commissions do. One of the things about having a broader forecasting power is it allows the council to possibly, should that be something that emerges in the fiscal in our amendment, it gives them a broader power to, for example, forecast the consequences of policies that might even, create more space for ministers to do more things, whether that's in relation to, could be anything, climate change, could be social justice policies, could be a whole range of things. I think that's something that we might want to reflect upon. I also thought it was interesting that they didn't seem to, while they indicated that there's a recruitment challenge because you're looking for a very specialist skill set, it doesn't sound like they have to have dozens upon dozens of people working in forecasting. I think they said 2 plus someone from the senior leadership team who provides oversight and input.
Out of a staff of 25, Chair.
Out of a staff of 25, which is obviously bigger than the fiscal council, but not. I'm not sure exactly what the number is of the fiscal council, but
half a dozen.
Yeah. Okay. But I thought that was interesting. I don't have any specific information requests arising out of that, but I think we'll have the Hansard report, and I think lots of important things that we'll keep in our minds. Sure, happy enough?
Sure, what we'll do is a lot of this information will ultimately pop up because members have raised specific issues in our bill table. So we capture the issues that you've raised. We particularly pay attention to the Hansard, but there's a number of things there that have come out of that are worth looking at. The phrase fiscal factors was particularly interesting. Yeah. That simple phrase is in the Scottish legislation, but it allows a lot of what Deirdre Hargey was talking about in terms of looking at the impact of climate change, social impact and so on, of fiscal decisions and fiscal actions, which is interesting.
Yes, I think
interesting
that
how
is-
they
I
apply
think
that.
that's interesting, and
It's a
they're-
very small phrase.
It's worth saying the bill, if anyone has looked, has got in front of them, it's a lot longer than our fiscal council bill, or significantly longer, I would say. It certainly seems to have many more clauses.
I'm sure the other thing to pick up
Yeah.
is the framework and the fact that they have to have a framework as part of the Scottish managing public money guidelines. Obviously, there's a managing public money Northern Ireland set of guidelines, but it doesn't touch areas like that. So that's also very interesting. That's a set of guidelines. That doesn't have to necessarily be set down in statute. That's something that the Department of Finance has a level of control over.
Yeah,
So that might be another useful issue to pick up. But we'll capture all this in our bill table when we bring that back to me.
Okay, great.
If you go back, Chair, to page 13.
We go back to 13. Okay, we'll do something else then.
There's a couple of agreements, so we dropped that one.
Okay, so we've got to go back to, what have we got to agree?
So,
13.
Chair, just
okay.
if we
So-
agree that,
oh, we
forget
didn't, yes.
that, and then do the rest of that.
Great, excellent. So I have to do a couple of agreements that I didn't clarify under a previous set of members. So to go back to the Office of the Examiner Statutory Rule report that we discussed in closed session on the Fiscal Council bill, members agree that we'll share that report with the bill clerk. I assume so, yes. We will come back and talk possibly next week about the OECD submission
Chair, if
that we have
members
on the
are
Fiscal Council bill.
content, if members are content to forward
Yeah.
the OECD submission to the department, we don't really want to sit on it any longer.
Yes,
because
we
they
didn't
need
do
to
that
see
last week.
No,
I think we
we're
should
gonna
send
wait
it and
to
get their
discuss it. I think
response
just they
to
need to be seeing that.
the traffic
So if
lights,
you're
because it is
content,
quite,
we'll
there
do
are,
that too.
it's really thorough and very authoritative.
Yeah.
Given that we assume the OECD will be doing reviews of the Fiscal Council, because they're doing reviews of
That was a new thing, Chair.
and I think we should
hadn't
ask,
thought
that
about
is one question actually, that now just occurs to me, we should ask if the department anticipates that the OECD would do reviews of the Fiscal Council here in the same way that presumably they do reviews of others, and presumably if they're doing it one in Scotland, they presumably will do one here. Okay, so now members, just going to go back to, I think we've got to agree a couple of other bits. And if you note, there's a Hansard transcript of, this is on the previous item, which is in relation to the Fiscal Council bill, page 107 of the meeting pack. There's a Hansard transcript of the oral briefing from department officials 2 weeks ago on the 24th September. Members are content that will be added to the evidence base. The next thing is page 15 of the table pack. There's a Dallow readout response of requests we made to the department. The department was asked to provide a formal response to the UUEPC submission of the bill. Gareth Hetherington from the Ulster University Economic Policy Centre will be giving us evidence on the 3rd of September. So
December, sorry.
December, it is December.
It is.
What did I say, September?
Yeah.
This is the 3rd of December. So if members are content, we will forward the response to Gareth whenever they get their response to us, so he can respond to that in the evidence session. Okay? Yeah, great. Okay, now we're going to go on to page 15 in my paper, which is an item which is page 119 on everyone else's pack, which is committee deliberations on the administrative and financial provisions bill. Page 119 is a Hansard transcript of the Department of Finance oral briefing on the Administrative and Financial Provisions Bill, which took place on the 24th September 25. This is going to be added to the evidence base for the committee stage. Members, at page 135 of the table pack, there is a response from the department on a few things. The department was asked to provide a formal response to the Assembly research paper on the bill, specifically a response to the Department of Finance relevant provisions on the bill, which are clause 1 and 18. However, a response was only received in relation to clause 20, which relates to the appointment of an external auditor for the NI Audit Office, which we've discussed in this committee before. The DALO has been informed that a response is required in relation to clause 1 and 18, and this will follow in due course. In the meantime, we are going to discuss the response given. We're going to discuss the clause 20 part. So that's to note, unless anybody wishes to discuss it, but you want to come in and talk on clause 20 and that controversial matter. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And just to clarify, I sit in the audit committee as well, and just to draw out from that, to emphasise again that they're saying that the cost the Department of Finance of running the procurement exercise is estimated to be £1,300 of staff costs every 3 to 5 years. It's a substantial cost in terms of staff terms for a committee to run that who do not have staff. So just to reiterate, it's not a small task there.
I think it's probably also true to say that the committee, were it to do it, would have to spend time and resource probably training a member of staff in procedure, and unless the audit committee already employ someone who's is a purchasing manager or has procurement capability and the bits of regulatory and kind of IT knowledge that are helpful. I'm not even sure, I'm sort of spoofing here myself, trying to guess the kind of things you need.
Expertise is not there, Chair.
They don't have that actually, so it would cost the committee more money because they'd have to either train someone or buy it in. So in any case, I think it's worth making that point. Okay, yeah, so if people are content, we will forward the response in clause 20 to the audit committee, 2 of whose members are on this committee, so they will see it twice. They can look surprised when they get it in the audit committee, so as not to spoil other people, the fun for other people. Agenda item 9 is the Strategic Asset Management Unit, written briefing from the Department of Finance. Members, that's at page 137 of the tabled pack. So this wasn't available in time for the main pack. So if you see that, the Government Land and Property Register is the single overarching register of all government land and assets. It consists of just over 8,000 buildings, main buildings, such as offices, schools, hospitals and other health facilities, along with 1,330 other buildings, including depots, warehouses, stores and recreational facilities. It encompasses approximately 1,146 square kilometres of land. That's all very interesting information. LPS initiated a piece of work to consider how the register could most effectively be used to facilitate better investment and asset management decisions, and subsequently developed a proposal to establish the Strategic Asset Management Unit, which is a multidisciplinary team of valuers, mapping and charting officers and a legal officer to provide departments with a comprehensive effort in terms of managing their assets, providing oversight and support for lease approvals and disposal of surplus assets. It is also responsible for the development and maintenance of a range of critical strategies and support. So, strategic asset management targets have been set for 25-26, which I presume includes, as part of the disposal, is connected to the disposals strategy. Progress will be tracked and formally presented to both the Asset Management Board and the Strategic Oversight Board. The Strategic Asset Management Unit, or SAMU if you prefer, will also lead the development of a new asset management strategy which will promote proactive asset management aligned with sustainability and climate commitments, opportunities for collaboration and service transformation, regeneration initiatives and the anticipated requirement for a more coordinated approach to surplus asset disposal. So I'm going to say a couple of things. We're actually going to move on in a second to talk about a very specific property disposal, and it would be helpful to understand it's sort of covered in this, but it's not entirely clear. It just gives a line or two saying, how does this factor in with the estate strategy and selling stuff off? There's a lot of management speak about how you strategically manage assets, but I suppose we know they're selling some off with a specific kind of revenue focus in mind, so it should be helpful to understand what, if this is part of that. I presume it is.
It should be,
yeah.
We just get clarification exactly how it's.
And obviously, this is bigger because some of these will be buildings that are not directly owned by the Northern Ireland Civil Service, or they have as in if they are things like. So, for example, we talked about the disposal strategy. The disposal strategy of a building that was a departmental office is a more direct, straightforward disposal to complete than a hospital which is owned by a trust, and therefore it's
absolutely,
or a former hospital. Not suggesting
stress that we're not suggesting anything like that's happening.
No, we're not. I'm just being clear that about the process, and I'm not suggesting that people are closing hospitals. But I mean, a building that was a health facility at one point that is no longer used in a particular site that is being disposed of, I presume is managed, and it'll obviously so just to understand, do these two things.
Chair,
just a line to explain how they interact with one another, and if they interact.
We'll get that.
Maybe it's me being idiotic, probably.
When you went for maximum selling hospitals, I was kind of.
No, don't worry. Do not. Yes, I don't want to be accused of that. Does anybody wish to come in on the strategic asset management unit? No. Oh yes. Okay. Members, we have been invited to to Lanyon Plaza for a further discussion on SAMU, including an overview of the land and property register. I am perfectly happy to do this. I think we should do it in sort of not kind of overload the Clerk team with trying to squeeze it in, given we've got bail scrutiny plus civil service work. If we can squeeze it in, we'll do it.
Chair, we have because members had talked before about wanting to go down to LPS to talk more generally about new systems put in place, the digitisation of systems and so on. So it fits quite well into that.
Great.
And if members are content to agree to a visit, we can schedule that without causing ourselves too many problems.
Sure, sounds good. Okay.
Thank you.
Members content with that? Yeah. Now, members of page 146 of the tabled pack, there's correspondence from the department regarding Marlborough House. The committee had previously requested it was kept informed of the decision to list Marlborough House, the department, which is in Craigavon. The department has now indicated that Historical Environment Division has advised that Marlborough House has been added, to the list of special buildings of special architectural or historical interest under Section 80 of the Planning Act NI as Grade B1. Marlborough House remains underoccupied, and the department plans to declare the site surplus in Q4 25-26, which I presume means this beginning of next year. The department is aware the listing decision may impact its ability to dispose of the site within the public sector. However, the department has indicated it will continue to work with its public sector partners to endeavour to protect the site from dereliction. That's to note unless anybody wishes to come in. Owen Townsend.
Yeah, it was just to say, Chair, I'd appreciate if we'd ask the department to keep us abreast of this, because I think there is real concern in Craigavon that the site may now lie derelict as opposed to being brought into any use in terms of the economy or community. As a result of this decision, I'm also conscious that there's a track record in Craigavon whereby natural environment hasn't always been protected. And so this would actually have been a suitable site for some development where there's been controversy in other parts of the town, the city. So I would just appreciate being kept up to date, both from a constituency perspective, but also just in terms of the impact on the department's estate strategy and rationalisation.
Okay, sure, I think that makes sense. Okay, members, now going to just, if I'm sure everyone else is content with that. Agenda item 10 is the end of session report for 24-25. That's on page 136 of the meeting pack, and it is really our end of session report for 24-25. The chairperson liaison group agreed the first end of session report should be published in September 25, providing a single source of information on the activities and achievements of each committee in order to generate an improved understanding of committee's work. The report drafted for members' consideration today reflects the key activities, inputs and achievements of the committee from 3rd of February 2024 up to the 31st of August 2025. Relevant statistics and photographs are also included, as well as our delivery and achievements. The report, once agreed, will be published on the committee's webpage. So, do any members have any comments on the committee? I would say, first of all, thank you to the Clerk team for preparing this. It gives an overview, obviously, in a kind of a sort of very balanced, impartial way of what we have been doing in terms of our work programme. Does anybody want to add anything to that? Brian Kingston.
Just in terms of the membership, it seems Harry and myself are included. We joined the committee on the 23rd of September.
Good point.
It's up to the end of August.
Membership.
Sorry?
We've just established it reflects the current membership, so at the time of its publishing, you'll be current membership, but not at the time. So, but it makes it clear that you joined after the actual
well, the date is
end of the
stated.
report.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's for current membership.
Okay, that's
because
fine.
it'll be dated at the time it's published.
Yeah.
When it's published, yeah. Which shouldn't be too long.
I'm just trying to think if there's anything we've missed out. It's nice pictures too, yeah.
A lot of pictures.
None of which I'm smiling properly in, but anyway, that's. Anyway, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to echo what you said, thanks very much for the team for putting this together. I think it's a good reflection of the wide range of work that we've covered in the period across sort of the civil law piece, the financial scrutiny, and just even going through the pictures, we've got out and about quite a lot. For people sometimes think that the finance committees, sitting in just number crunching all the time. We've got out and about a lot, and I think it just captures the good work of the team across all parties of the committee. So thanks very much.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think that's very true. I think this is a committee, obviously we deal with political matters and we make political points, but it's also a huge amount of substance we have to get through on a kind of in technical and kind of cross-party way. So there's a lot there, and there'll be a lot more coming, including the banking reports, I think, really stand to us. Okay, thank you very much. If any proposed amendments, I don't actually have any amendments, which is unusual for me. I'm usually tinker with things, but if members don't have any amendments, then I'm going to go through the report and just get formal agreement to each section of it. The title page, contents page, powers and membership is first. I'm going to put in the membership of the committee section, I'm going to put the question that members are members content with the title page, contents page, remit powers and membership of the committee section. Are they content that stand part of the report? Content? Great. Now, key activities, members. I'm going to refer you to the key activities, outputs and achievement sections of the section of the report. I'm going to put the question: are members content that the key activities, outputs and achievement section stand part of the report? Content. Appendices. Are you content that the appendices stand part of the report? Content. I'm going to finally put the question that the Committee for Finance end of session report 24-25 be the 7th report of the Committee for Finance. Content? Content. Great, thank you, and thanks all who helped draft it. Agenda item 11 is correspondence. 11.1, Marie Curie have corresponded with us on death reporting processes in Northern Ireland. That's at page 163. We've been copied into correspondence from Vice NI and Marie Curie to the Finance Minister regarding a meeting between departmental officials and staff from the TELUS Once system, which is operated in Britain. I don't know if it's operated by the UK government, I presume so. Advice NI and Marie Curie previously met the Finance Minister to explore any option that would simplify the death reporting process. This may involve expanding the DFC bereavement service or onboarding to the GB TELUS Once system. It is mentioned that the Finance and Communities Ministers are planning to meet to discuss cross-departmental work in this regard, and I would strongly endorse that. And I think given some of the simplifications that are part of the deaths, baby loss, stillbirth bill, this is a kind of another simplification at a time of difficulty for people. So if progress can be made, I think we'd like to be kept abreast of that. Maybe so we could ask the Finance Department just to keep us abreast. Was you content? Right. 11.2 is from the Youth Assembly, and that's an update at page 164 on the Youth Assembly. Agenda item 12 is the draft forward work programme. So that's page 169, and the clerk is going to update us on it.
Chair, really the only kind of new element of that is seeking oral briefings on the legislative consent motions. So we have the two. We have the Public Office Bill and we also have the Cybersecurity Bill. Members will recall that there are some complexities around the Public Office Bill with the Health Minister indicating that he also wants to bring forward legislation on that. Although I think where the departments are currently at is they're waiting to see all of the outcomes of the bill itself, the Public Office Bill itself, before there's any further legislation here. So we have tentatively looked at scheduling an oral briefing on that for 5th of November. With the other bill, we're still waiting for a kind of final pin down from the department to bring in a date on that. So we'll come back to members once we have it, but that's effectively it, Chair.
Right. Okay. Terrific. So, members, as always, you agreed that we'll publish that in the forward work programme on the web pages. Then, agenda item 13, any other business? Is there any other business that you wish to raise? No? Okay. And then, agenda item 14, date, time and place of next meeting. The next meeting will be here in this room, Wednesday 15th of October at 2 p.m. In the Senate chamber. And I'll put the question to the committee, do you now adjourn? Sorry, before we adjourn.
Just before we adjourn.
Before I put the question, I hadn't finished putting the question, so we're not adjourned.
Just to remind everyone about 10:30 tomorrow morning, if members are in the building, for Gemma's event down by the railings at the apron.
Yeah.
And then our own event next Tuesday at 2:30, where if we meet in the Great Hall, we're meeting with representatives from Forget Me Nots, and we'll do our own sort of bits to camera and so on with them. So tomorrow at 10:30, Tuesday at 2:30, and I'll put out reminders for both of those on the WhatsApp, okay?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to put the question out. The committee be adjourned. The committee's now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks all.
Senate Chamber. Sound. Senate Chamber. Sound. Senate Chamber. Sound.